If you've heard of the DPRK, you're almost certain to have heard of Air Koryo, the often mysterious national carrier of Korea, ferrying people in and out of Pyongyang and responsible for maintaining a fleet of vintage Soviet-era aircraft. Most people know about the airline from YouTube travel vlogs or internet rankings, but that only covers part of their story. For nearly 80 years, this airline has connected Korea with the outside world, linking the DPRK with China, the former Soviet Union, Southeast Asia, and even as far as Europe. The ebb and flow of Air Koryo's history mirrors the country it represents, shifting with time and geopolitical alliances. So, rather than relying on myths and anecdotes, we're going to reconstruct Air Koryo's history using its own official records and publications, diving into the history of the DPRK's flag carrier through historical documents, airline timetables, and a few promotional brochures. This is the full history of Air Koryo. The birth of domestic Korean aviation came hot on the heels of the liberation of Korea from the Japanese at the end of the Second World War. Korea, which had been divided into North and South along the 38th parallel, saw its northern half governed by a Provisional People's Committee and the Soviet Civil Administration. In the first months of the new administration, the Socialist Provisional Government encouraged the growth of local mass organisations. Records note the founding of an aviation corps in Sinuiju in October 1945, primarily formed by pilots and technicians who had experience with Chinese and Soviet aviation. It's safe to assume that these small organisations popped up in local centres around the country until, on the 15th of December 1945, these scattered societies were unified into the Korean Aviation Society, or Choson Hankong Hyopue. By late 1946, this civilian flying organisation decided to broaden its role in preparation for the creation of a new air force, becoming the Bukchoson Hankong Konsol Wiwonhue, or North Korean Aviation Construction Committee. This organisation's stated goal, in a December 1946 meeting of its Central Committee, was to establish new training and research institutes into aviation, promote a culture of flying, publish related materials, magazines and periodicals, and eventually operate air mail and passenger transport. Naturally, around this time, much more focus was placed on the development of a military air corps, with the country still reeling from decades of military occupation by Japan and the need to build new national defence infrastructure. This is where the Korean War shifted progress entirely away from civil aviation and onto the military. As Korea's civil air industry took a break for 3 years, I'll take this quick opportunity to thank those who support DPRK Explained on Patreon. If you want to join a team that makes the channel possible, please check out the link in the description to lend your support. It's greatly appreciated. In December 1953, a few months after the Korean War ended in an armistice, officials from the DPRK and Soviet Union met to sign the 조선항공 운수주 식회사 사업 개시 이정서, or Protocol on the Commencement of Business of the Soviet Korean Air Transport Joint Stock Company. This new joint venture between Moscow and Pyongyang represented an early example of post-war infrastructure development and cooperation between the two socialist states. Soon after the agreement was signed, the first international route from Pyongyang was inaugurated, a twice-weekly flight between the Korean capital and the Soviet Siberian city of Chita. Despite it being a small city, the connection allowed for onward connecting flights for passengers and freight through the domestic network within the USSR using their flag carrier Aeroflot. This international flight was soon followed in May 1954 by a domestic route, connecting Pyongyang with the east coast city of Hamhung, and then onwards north to the city of Chongjin. Although these may seem like random choices, the move was likely made to link these industrial centres to create a kind of heavy industry corridor from the capital stretching up the east coast, connecting these port cities with Pyongyang and the ever-expanding railway network. Finally, the most significant development to date occurred on the 21st of December 1955, when the cabinet of the DPRK formally established a national airline, superseding the Korean-Soviet Joint Company by taking ownership of all foreign shares. This new airline would be known as Choson Minhang, or Korean Airlines. By the end of the 1950s, Choson Minhang was operating regular flights to Chita in the USSR via Shenyang in China. They were operating direct flights from Pyongyang to Beijing, and their first multi-stop connection established in March 1959, linking Pyongyang with Moscow, with stopovers in Irkutsk and Omsk. During the 1960s, Choson Minhang continued to modernize its fleet, introducing new Ilyushin IL-18s, which boasted a longer range, new turboprop engines, and a higher passenger capacity. In fact, today, Air Koryo is the last airline in the world able to operate an IL-18, which is occasionally used for flights up to the far northern Paektusan region, although this is increasingly becoming less common. As the 1960s became the 1970s, Pyongyang began to turn its sights towards replacing its aging turboprops with new, modern jetliners. As a close ally of the Soviet Union, which had itself been responsible for helping jumpstart Choson Minhang as an airline, it only made sense to look to Moscow for new aircraft. The airline took delivery of their first Tupolev 154 in 1975. Meanwhile, the Ilyushin IL-62 was first introduced around the early 1980s. These new jets, alongside the smaller Tupolev 134, formed the backbone of Choson Minhang's growing international network, and during this decade, flights from Pyongyang expanded at a rate of knots. By the end of the 1980s, we get our first glimpse at an early Choson Minhang passenger brochure. It shows us that short-range international routes, like Pyongyang to Khabarovsk, were flown by the smaller Tu-134. But by now, the Tu-154 had become the workhorse of the fleet, with regular flights to Beijing and to Moscow via Irkutsk and Novosibirsk. The IL-62, however, was the first true long-haul jetliner, with direct, non-stop flights between Pyongyang and Moscow, and even a flight connecting the Korean capital with East Germany via Moscow. There was even a Tu-154 flight introduced a year later in 1990, connecting Pyongyang with Sofia, the Bulgarian capital, via Irkutsk, Novosibirsk, and Moscow. These long-range international routes tell us a lot about the state of Korea's international affairs by the end of the Cold War. Beijing was one of Choson Minhang's most important and frequent international routes. The 1989 timetable shows the service running twice a week on Mondays and Wednesdays, and then again on a Friday, this time operated by partner airline Air China. Similarly, Moscow was the political and operational heart of the Russo-Korean relationship. The non-direct Moscow flight departed every Monday from Pyongyang, with the direct flight departing every Thursday. The Soviet Union's Aeroflot were also a partner airline, running a direct flight from Moscow to Pyongyang every Sunday. The weekly flight to Berlin was perhaps the most symbolic of the entire schedule, with this flight connecting through Moscow every Thursday, linking the westernmost and easternmost points of the communist world. The DPRK at East Germany actually enjoyed a very close relationship during the Cold War, with many East German architects instrumental in the city planning and architecture that took place across the DPRK in the years following the Korean War. Although no operating flights are listed, this 1989 brochure still lists the German Democratic Republic's flagship carrier, Interflug, as a partner airline. The two remaining listed routes, Khabarovsk and Sofia, served two very different purposes: connecting the DPRK with the Russian Far East to support economic and technical cooperation projects in the region, which has historically had very significant Korean influence, and to serve as a gateway to the Balkan region of Eastern Europe, proving that Choson Minhang wasn't simply an airline to serve its two larger neighbours. By 1991, with the Cold War drawing to a close, we get a final glimpse of the height of Choson Minhang as a major international carrier. This brochure highlights not only the routes being operated, but then, from each destination, where one might travel onwards. For example, a local traveller catching the 9:05 flight from Pyongyang to Beijing can find themselves, according to this brochure, connecting onwards to Bangkok, Hong Kong, Karachi, Singapore, Tokyo, or even Zurich, Frankfurt and London. A more regional journey might see one taking the Choson Minhang 9:30 flight from Pyongyang to Khabarovsk and connecting onwards to Irkutsk, Ratsk, Moscow, Tashkent or Sakhalinsk. Not to mention the wide variety of listed connections on a Korean flight to Berlin or Sofia, which provided a gateway to all of Eastern and Western Europe, with even a connecting flight from Moscow all the way to Havana, Cuba. This peak of DPRK air travel, right at the end of the Cold War, is highlighted best by this final brochure, printed for the 1991-1992 winter, during which the Soviet Union would collapse. It shows Choson Minhang had offices in China, the USSR, Germany and Bulgaria, whilst also showing some of the only tourist advertising we've seen in these leaflets, pushing travellers to visit Mount Kumgang on Korea's eastern seaboard. Leafing through this document shows that by 1991, the DPRK's flag carrier was a sophisticated national airline flying in and out of some of the world's major capitals, and no doubt it was keen to expand further. However, this timeline would not see completion, as 1991 ended with a dramatic shake-up for Korea and for the world. December 1991 brought with it the dissolution of the USSR. But surprisingly, not the end of flights to Eastern Europe and Russia. Departures from Pyongyang and destination airports in Berlin, Sofia and Moscow continued well into the 1990s. Just because the political situation changed didn't mean that the practical relationships between these countries ended as well. In fact, 7 years on from the fall of Soviet communism, the DPRK's flag carrier was operating to more destinations than ever before. The classics remained: Moscow, Berlin, Sofia, Beijing, but now with new destinations like Bangkok in Thailand, Macau in China, and Vladivostok in the Russian Far East. In fact, the most notable shift in the airline's operations during this period was more of an aesthetic choice, as on the 28th of March 1992, Chosun Minhang Korean Airlines rebranded into the airline we're familiar with today, Air Koryo. The new Air Koryo seemingly took the end of the Cold War not as a chance to cut ties with existing allies and partners, but instead to shift away from the more ideologically dictated routes and destinations which limited them to Eastern Europe, China and the Soviet Union, but to expand regionally, increasing their links with Southeast Asia and their confidently growing economies. Here's where we're going to pause the chronology for a moment and look at how to read and understand these timetables. Because on top of being interesting aviation documents, they provide a fascinating look into the past. As a quick, brief and quirky example, we can see the shift between referring to Germany as Dokil to Deutschlander between 1998 and 2002, demonstrating the DPRK's new language directive to refer to foreign countries, in most cases, using their endonyms or domestic names. Each of these brochures boasts different artwork, whether it be an Ilyushin IL-62 flying over Pyongyang Airport, the then newly built Kwangbok Street in Pyongyang, or a plane flying high above the Korean capital's skyline. In effect, as one of the first documents a new visitor to the country might see, some of these brochures can almost be seen as quasi-guidebooks, as well as simple airline leaflets. On the older schedules from the 1980s and early 1990s, we can see clear diagrams outlining the flight number, the aircraft in service on the route, the class of service, whether standard or first class, and the day that each service operates. On the newer versions, each brochure is equipped with the full flight schedule to each destination, along with a full layout of the aircraft in question. This example from 2013, you might notice some oddities that we haven't mentioned yet, namely a flight to Malaysia and the aircraft type PU-204-300. Well, that brings us neatly onto our final chapter, modernization. The modernization of Air Koryo really began in 2008. Until then, the airline had been continuing to use the Ilyushin 62s and the Tupolev 154s and 134s to operate their international routes. However, in 2008, the airline purchased two new Tupolev 204s to modernize their fleet, resulting in these planes taking over the bulk of international flight duties. Around the mid-2000s, however, the connections to Moscow and Europe had ground to a close, despite the opening of a new route between Pyongyang and Kuala Lumpur. By 2013, Air Koryo was operating regular flights between Pyongyang and Beijing, Shenyang, Vladivostok, Kuala Lumpur, and Bangkok. The original workhorse of the long-haul fleet, the IL-62, saw one of its aircraft converted to become the official aircraft of the DPRK government, as by the mid-2010s, every published international route would use the more modern 204, with the older aircraft instead used to fly internal routes to domestic destinations. As some of you may know, around 2019 to 2020, I worked in DPRK tourism and used to have the Air Koryo schedule printed off at my desk to keep track of when we'd be able to get tourists in and out of the countries and from which cities Air Koryo would be operating from. However, all of this ground to a close in 2020, as COVID saw the country close its borders indefinitely, ceasing all international flights for the first time since the 1950s. As for what the future holds for Air Koryo, it's difficult to say. And this is where we move from concrete history towards more speculation. So long as the DPRK remains hampered by sanctions, their ability to expand their fleet by purchasing new jets is limited. However, there have been murmurings around re-establishing a link between Moscow and Pyongyang, whether through Air Koryo or a Russian airline, given the recent close relationship between the two governments. Air Koryo continues to operate flights between Beijing, Shenyang and Vladivostok, mostly serving to transport business travellers, diplomats and Russian tourists in and out of the country. As such, the airline still serves as a gateway for foreign visitors into Pyongyang. Throughout history, the domestic travel network has been dominated by rail, rendering the need for a mass expansion of domestic flights relatively limited. This has perhaps been even further guaranteed by a recent announcement of plans to modernise the nation's rural railway stations, so a renovated domestic air network seems unnecessary. In short, who knows what the future holds for Air Koryo? As always, its future is linked to much larger geopolitical forces, as it always has been. Just as the Cold War opened up new links to Berlin, Moscow and the Warsaw Pact, the growing influence of the DPRK on the world stage and a flourishing relationship both with China and Russia could see services expand as the countries continue to extend their cooperation. With any luck, it won't be too long before we can find ourselves flying Air Koryo once again. These documents, brochures and pamphlets were never intended to be history books. However, together they form a tapestry of the history of Air Koryo, a name that most people who know about the DPRK have heard before. But on top of all of that, they serve to tell the story of Korea's relationship with the wider world, how geopolitical alliances ebb and flow and relationships blossom and sour. All in all, the legacy and history of Air Koryo is perhaps much more extensive than one might have thought, and I hope you've enjoyed finding out a little more about the history of this airline. For all those who are watching this video, please hit the subscribe button and join the great many people that have helped to keep the channel growing, and click the like button to help the video in the algorithm. If you want to help out more directly, which would be greatly appreciated, then please take a moment to check out the Patreon linked in the description to join one of our tiers and support DPRK Explained in a real, pragmatic way. For those higher tiers, you can join these lovely people on screen now at the end of every video, and for every other tier, you'll get behind the scenes updates on what's coming next on the channel. We also have merchandise available, from t-shirts and hoodies to posters and stickers, so please take a moment to check that out if you're interested. It also helps to support DPRK Explained in a real, practical sense. Once again, thank you for watching this video, and I'll see you in the next video.